For most of recorded history, one question has separated the powerful from everyone else. Not how well you could fight, but who decided you were allowed to. Every ruling class in history has faced this problem. Every one of them solved it the same way. They wrote it down, passed it to their children, and called it tradition. Japan's answer to that problem lasted 7 centuries. It produced one of the most recognizable figures in human history, and almost everything people believe about that figure is wrong. The samurai spent more time doing paperwork than drawing swords. They borrowed money from the people they legally outranked. They enforced a peace they found suffocating, carried weapons they were rarely permitted to use, and built an administration so rigid it could not survive contact with the outside world. And when the end came, the men who dismantled the samurai system were samurai themselves. What follows is the story of a ruling class, how it was built, how it calcified, and how it looked in the mirror and chose to disappear. The word came before the warrior, long before the armor, the blade, the code, before any of the imagery that the world now associates with Japan's most recognizable figure. There was a verb, saburao. It meant to serve, to attend, to stand close to someone of rank and wait upon their need. The man who did this was a samurai, not a fighter, a servant. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in the story that follows. Japan in the 800s was an imperial state modeled on Tang China. The emperor sat at the center of a vast bureaucratic system, the Ritsuyo, that assigned every person a rank, a role, and a relationship to the state. Officials wrote documents. Administrators collected taxes. Scholars composed poetry in Chinese. The court at Heian, in what is now Kyoto, was a place of extraordinary cultural refinement, where the correct angle of a sleeve at a formal ceremony was considered a matter of genuine consequence. Violence had no place in this world, not openly. The Heian aristocracy considered physical force a kind of vulgarity, something to be managed at a distance, outsourced to men of lower standing who could be employed and forgotten. The court did not lack intelligence about the value of coercive power. It simply preferred not to see it. And in the provinces, far from the perfumed halls of the capital, there were men well suited to providing it. Those provinces were restless. The Ritsuyo system depended on imperial governors traveling out from the capital to distant territories and forward their tax revenues back to Heian-kyo. In practice, those governors often managed their postings as opportunities for personal enrichment, and the local clans who actually controlled the land, who had cleared it, farmed it, and defended it for generations, found themselves squeezed from above by officials they had never chosen and would never trust. Some of those clans pushed back. They armed themselves, formed alliances with neighboring families, and built fighting forces capable of resisting the magistrates sent to extract what the court considered its due. They were farmers who had picked up weapons, then passed the weapons to their sons, then their sons passed them to theirs. Within a generation or two, the sword was no longer a tool of necessity. It was an inheritance. The emperor's court, for all its disdain of violence, needed these men. The Emishi people of northeastern Honshu, the long unconquered territory the court called its frontier, would not submit to imperial authority through documents alone. Someone had to go north and fight. The court reached for the provincial warrior clans, mounted men trained in archery and close combat, and sent them in. A general named Sakanue no Tamuramaro was given the title Sei Taishogun, commander against the eastern barbarians, and led those campaigns in the late 700s and early 800s. The title was temporary, a military appointment for the duration of the fighting. No one imagined what it would become. The fighting men the court was relying on did not call themselves samurai. The older terms, bushi, mononofu, were used for warriors of various kinds. Saburai still meant attendant, someone who served a person of rank in close proximity. But proximity to power has a way of accumulating its own weight. As warrior clans embedded themselves in the households of the capital aristocracy, providing protection, running errands, managing the physical enforcement that the nobles required, the word began to shift. A samurai was still a servant, but the servants were armed. By the middle of the Heian period, the great aristocratic families of the capital were openly dependent on two warrior clans above all others, the Minamoto and the Taira. Both had roots in the imperial family, distant branches of a lineage that had grown too numerous to support at court. They had been pushed outward into the provinces, given land and local authority, and told to make themselves useful. They did. They raised their own armies, extended their protection to smaller landholders in exchange for loyalty, and built networks of obligation that spread across entire regions. The Shogun system accelerated everything. Private estates, tracts of land granted to aristocrats, temples, and powerful families with exemption from imperial taxation were spreading across the countryside by the 10th and 11th centuries. By the 1100s, nearly half the farmland in Japan was held as private estate rather than public land assessed by the court. Each of those estates needed protection. The men who provided it expected payment, and payment meant land rights. Land meant status. Status meant power. The warriors were accumulating all three. What crystallized in the late Heian period was not yet a formal class. It was something more organic, a social position, a recognized function, a category of person that everyone understood and no one had officially defined. The samurai were men who served. But they served with swords, and the men who held Japan's land were beginning to understand that the swords mattered more than the service. The court at Heian-kyo operated on a principle that sounds strange until you understand the logic behind it. Violence was beneath the dignity of a civilized man. The emperor was divine. His ministers were scholars and poets. The business of governing the paperwork, the ceremonies, the careful management of rank and precedent was the work of refined human beings who had studied the Chinese classics and could compose a verse in the correct season. The business of fighting was something else, something to be contracted out. The Ritsuryo system had provided for armies in theory. Universal conscription drawn from the peasantry, organized by the state, answerable to the emperor. In practice, the system had quietly collapsed. Emperor Kamu abolished universal conscription in the 700s, and with it went the idea of a standing imperial army. The soldiers the court needed for frontier campaigns came from somewhere else from the provincial clans. The armed men of the countryside who had been accumulating military capability for generations, while the capital perfected its art. The Fujiwara understood dependency before anyone else named it. Through the 9th and 10th centuries, this single family had cemented its grip on the imperial court, not through military power, but through marriage, placing their daughters as consorts to emperors, raising the resulting heirs in Fujiwara households, governing as regents in the emperor's names. At the height of the regency, in the early 1100s, Fujiwara no Michinaga had 4 daughters married to 4 successive emperors. His grandsons sat on the throne. He held the court in his palm. And yet he had no army of his own. That absence mattered. The Fujiwara needed fighters to settle disputes, suppress rebellions, and enforce the authority of distant estates. They turned to the warrior clans, the Minamoto and the Taira above all, and paid them in rank, land rights, and imperial recognition. A minor aristocratic title awarded to a clan leader was worth more than gold. It placed a fighting man inside the system of legitimacy, gave his violence the sanction of the state, and made his sons slightly easier to employ than a common brigand. The warrior clans absorbed this lesson completely. They competed for imperial recognition not because they valued ceremony, but because ceremony translated directly into power. A man whose fighting capacity was recognized by the court had something. A man whose fighting capacity was merely feared did not the right to act, to collect, to demand, backed by the authority of the state. That right was the beginning of what the samurai would become. By the 11th century, the Shogun estates were breeding conflicts faster than the court could manage. Private landholders competed with each other over boundaries, water rights, and harvest claims. The governors the court sent to administer the provinces were often absent. They drew their salaries from the capital and hired local men to do the actual work. Those local men were increasingly warriors, and the distinction between protecting an estate and controlling it had begun to dissolve. The court watched this and reached for the tool it had always used. When a warrior clan threatened to cause trouble, the court hired another clan to neutralize it. The reward was always the same: a title, a land grant, a small promotion within the hierarchy of imperial rank. The court believed it was managing the warriors. The warriors were learning that the court needed them more than it admitted. In the 1150s, that arrangement finally cracked open. In 1156, a dispute over imperial succession pulled the Minamoto and Taira into the capital itself and set them fighting in the streets of Heian. This was the Hogan Rebellion, 2 days of violence inside the city that the court had spent centuries treating as a sanctuary of refinement. The warriors who stood in the rubble afterwards understood something the Fujiwara regents could not ignore. Whoever held the swords held the government. 4 years later, the lesson was confirmed. In 1160, Taira no Kiyomori emerged from the Heiji Rebellion as the single most powerful man in Japan. He had crushed the Minamoto faction, sent the young Minamoto heir Yoritomo into exile on the Izu Peninsula, and stood alone at the top of the court's military hierarchy. What he did next revealed exactly what the samurai system had become. He did not overthrow the court. He joined it. He adopted court manners, climbed the bureaucratic ranks, and in 1167 became the first man from a warrior family to hold the position of chief minister of the imperial government. Kiyomori married his daughter into the imperial family. His grandson sat on the throne as Emperor Antoku. He was reproducing, with military backing, precisely the strategy the Fujiwara had used for centuries: the marriage alliance, the regency, the family member at the center of the court's legitimacy. A warrior chief had become a courtier, but the court remained unchanged in its structure. The emperor still reigned. The rituals still ran. Violence still held its proper distance, just barely, from the machinery of ceremony. The distance did not hold. Kiyomori died of fever in 1181. Midway through the civil war his overreach had provoked. The Genpei War, 5 years of fighting between the Minamoto and Taira clans, ended in 1185 with the naval battle of Dan no Yura, where the young Emperor Antoku drowned in the inland sea, carried down by his grandmother as the Taira fleet collapsed. The Taira were destroyed as a political force. The Minamoto stood alone, and their leader, Yoritomo, looked at the court at Heian and understood that he did not want what Kiyomori had wanted. He did not want to join the court. He wanted to build something beside it, something that the court could not absorb, could not title away, could not manage with a well-timed marriage. Yoritomo chose Kamakura deliberately. It was a fishing settlement on the eastern coast of Honshu, facing the sea with mountains at its back, defensible, remote, and a full 5 days' journey from the imperial capital at Kyoto. That distance was the point. He was not building a rival court. He was building something the court could not recognize, could not absorb, and could not dismantle by simply promoting him to a sufficiently comfortable position within it. He called his government a bakufu, a tent government, the headquarters of a military commander in the field. The name acknowledged what he was making no effort to conceal. This was a warrior administration, and it made no apologies for that fact. The emperor remained. Yoritomo never disputed imperial legitimacy, never tried to seize the throne, never moved to replace the rituals and hierarchies of Heian with anything of his own invention in that sphere. The emperor performed the ceremonies. The court composed its poetry. The aristocracy retained its titles, its estates, many of them, and its dignity. Yoritomo took everything else. He took the administration of justice between warriors. He took the authority to appoint military governors to the provinces. He took the right to install stewards on the shogun estates throughout Japan, men answerable to Kamakura rather than to Kyoto. And he took all of this without ever formally saying that he had done so. That fiction emperor as sovereign, shogun as administrator, would define Japanese politics for nearly 7 centuries. The instrument he built was the gokunin system. A gokunin was a direct vassal of the shogunate, a warrior who had written his name in the roster, sworn his oath, and entered into a relationship of mutual obligation with the Minamoto. In exchange for loyal military service and administrative duty, the shogunate confirmed the Gokunin's right to his land. That confirmation was everything. In a world where land rights were contested, where shogun boundaries were disputed and rival claims multiplied, the shogunate's seal on a document saying, "This land is yours," was worth more than any number of swords. The Gokunin did not merely serve Yoritomo. They needed him to exist as they were. The Jito were the Gokunin's most important appointment. A Jito was a steward, a warrior placed on a shogun estate to manage it, collect taxes, maintain order, and report to Kamakura. Before 1185, those estates had been administered by representatives of the court aristocracy, men who drew their income from distant holdings they rarely visited. The Jito replaced them with men who actually lived on the land, knew its rhythms, and answered to the warrior government rather than the old nobility. The court watched its economic base being quietly reorganized from beneath it and could do nothing about it. The Shugo sat above the Jito in each province, a military governor responsible for policing the shogunate's vassals, conducting judicial proceedings in cases of rebellion and murder, and mustering warriors when the shogunate called. Shugo and Jito together gave Kamakura something no previous government had possessed: direct administrative reach into the countryside, enforced not by distant decree, but by men with horses and weapons who lived among the people they governed. The Heian court had claimed authority over the provinces for 4 centuries. Yoritomo actually had it. The structure required legitimacy that Kamakura could not generate for itself. Imperial recognition mattered enormously, not because the emperor held real power, but because the hierarchy of titles, ranks, and legal sanctions still flowed from the throne. When the emperor granted Yoritomo the title of Sei Shogun in 1192, he was not bestowing power. He was acknowledging what already existed, but the acknowledgement was still necessary. The shogunate needed the court's ceremonial approval precisely because it had bypassed the court's actual authority. Form and reality had separated, and both sides needed to pretend they had not. Yoritomo died in 1199, thrown from a horse. His sons were unable to hold the power he had built. Within 2 decades, the real authority inside the Bakufu had shifted to the Hojo clan, the family of Yoritomo's own wife, Hojo Masako. The Hojo became regents to the shoguns, who became figureheads governing in the name of an emperor who was himself a figurehead. Japan in the early 1300s had 3 layers of government, each formally subordinate to the one above it, and each in practice subordinate to the one below. The true rulers, the Hojo regents, held their power by controlling men who theoretically controlled an emperor who theoretically ruled everything. The absurdity was the system. It worked because everyone agreed to behave as though it made sense. What Kamakura had built was not a military dictatorship in any simple sense. It was a parallel administrative state that embedded itself inside the existing order without replacing it. Warriors governed the provinces. Warriors collected taxes from the estates. Warriors ran the courts that settled disputes between other warriors. But poets still wrote verses in Kyoto. Priests still conducted their rituals. Emperors still performed the ceremonies that maintained the cosmic order. The division was so precise, so carefully maintained, that the fiction of dual sovereignty lasted not years, but centuries. The class structure that would eventually become the rigid samurai hierarchy was already visible in Kamakura's template. At the top, the shogunate and its direct vassals, the Gokenin, roughly 2,000 families who had fought for Yoritomo and been rewarded with confirmed land rights. Below them, the samurai they, in turn, employed mounted warriors with surnames, men of local standing who provided military service to their immediate lord. Below them, the foot soldiers, men without surnames, without land, with nothing to offer but their bodies and their labor. The categories were not yet as fixed as they would later become. A talented fighter could still rise, but the direction of the system was already clear, towards hereditary hierarchy, inherited obligation, and land rights confirmed from above. The lesson that Kamakura taught, the one every subsequent shogunate would study, was that the real foundation of samurai power was administrative, not military. Yoritomo had won the Genpei War. But it was not the war that made him the most powerful man in Japan. It was the Jito network, the Gokunin rosters, the provincial governors answerable to Kamakura, the legal apparatus that settled disputes and confirmed property rights. The sword had opened the door. The paperwork had locked it behind him. In 1221, the retired Emperor Go-Toba tested the entire structure by issuing a call to arms against the Hojo regency. He expected the Gokunin to defer to imperial authority. Instead, nearly all of them sided with Kamakura. They sided with the institution that confirmed their land, settled their disputes, and protected their hereditary claims. 3 cloistered emperors were exiled as a result. The Hojo extended the Jito system across estates that had supported the rebellion, reaching deeper into the court's economic foundations than ever before. The lesson was delivered clearly and without ambiguity. The warriors had not been managing the emperor's land. The emperor had been sitting on the warrior's land. Japan had simply needed 26 years to make that plain. What the Kamakura period left behind was a template, a set of institutional arrangements that would be broken, rebuilt, modified, and finally perfected over the next 4 centuries. The shogunate beside the court, the warrior administrator as the real governor, the emperor as the source of legitimacy that no one could actually afford to dispense with. The land grant as the foundation of the entire relationship, all of it was already present in what Yoritomo had built in his fishing town by the sea. The men who came after him would spend the rest of Japanese history adjusting the details. The Ashikaga shogunate had governed Japan since the 1330s, but it had never governed it well. Where Yoritomo had built from a position of total military dominance, the Ashikaga shogunate rested on a narrower base, one that depended on the cooperation of powerful regional lords who were always one succession crisis away from deciding they no longer needed the arrangement. That crisis arrived in 1467. A dispute over who should inherit the shogunate ignited a war in the streets of Kyoto, and within a decade the city lay in ruins. The shogunate had become a fiction, and Japan had shattered into something that had no precedent in its history. The Onin War burned for 10 years and resolved nothing. The eastern and western armies fought each other through the streets and temples of Heian until the city that had been the center of Japanese civilization for nearly 7 centuries was reduced to scorched timbers and empty lots. When the fighting finally exhausted itself in 1477, neither side had won. The shogun still held his title. The emperor still held his. Both were irrelevant. The war had not produced a new order. It had dissolved the old one. And what filled the space was not governance but competition, pure, undisguised, and continuous. The word the Japanese used for what followed was Gekkokujo, those below, overcoming those above. It described something that was not supposed to happen, a retainer defeating his lord, a branch family seizing the inheritance of the main line, a man of obscure origin rising to command men of ancient lineage. It was not admired. It was feared, and it was everywhere. Deputies overthrew their shugo governors. Branch families displaced their seniors. Villages armed themselves and drove out their landlords. The hierarchy that had structured Japanese society for 3 centuries did not bend under the pressure. It snapped. A man who could fight and who could hold together the men who fought for him could go as far as his nerve and his competence would take him. This was new. Not entirely new, the Kamakura and Ashikaga periods had always contained some possibility of advancement through military service, but the scale was different now. In the Sengoku period, the old families were dying, the old alliances were dissolving, and the men who filled the vacuum were sometimes farmers who had picked up a spear and found they had a talent for organization. The category of samurai was, briefly, porous, in a way it had never been and would never be again. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the most spectacular example of what this porosity made possible. He had been born around 1537 to a peasant family in Owari province. His father, a foot soldier, his family without land, rank, or name of any consequence. He entered the service of Oda Nobunaga as an ashigaru, a common foot soldier, and rose through Nobunaga's increasingly powerful organization on the basis of intelligence, relentless competence, and an ability to read a political situation that his more aristocratic colleagues could never match. By the time Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582, Hideyoshi was his most capable general. Within months of his lord's death, he had outmaneuvered every rival for the succession and seized control of Nobunaga's entire domain. Hideyoshi's rise is extraordinary, but it is also, in its own way, a demonstration of the rule, rather than its exception. Because the first thing Hideyoshi did once he had consolidated power was to make certain that no one could ever do what he had done. He understood, better than anyone, what his own existence implied about the fragility of hierarchy, and he set about repairing that fragility with the same energy he had spent dismantling it. Every successful warlord of the Sengoku period did something similar. The moment a daimyo consolidated enough territory to stop worrying about immediate destruction, he turned to the problem of maintaining what he had. That meant codifying the relationships between himself and his vassals, establishing clear lines of inheritance, confirming land rights, and building administrative structures that did not depend on the continued personal charisma of a single man. The new daimyo were constructing, out of the rubble of the old order, the same thing the old order had always been: a hierarchy of inherited obligation with themselves at the top. Oda Nobunaga had grasped this instinct for order before any of his rivals. He reorganized his domain on lines that prefigured everything that followed: careful land surveys, land rights withheld from retainers and managed centrally, territories assigned and reassigned on the basis of performance rather than hereditary claim. He was brutal about it. Vassals who failed lost their lands. Vassals who succeeded received more. The system was meritocratic in its operating logic and ruthlessly hierarchical in its structure. Nobunaga at the top, his generals below, their retainers below them, and no one permitted to blur the lines. The castle was the Sengoku period's most visible symbol of this reconstitution of order. Every successful daimyo built one stone-based, defensible, commanding the surrounding territory from a position that announced permanence and authority. The castle was not merely a military installation. It was a political statement. It said, "I am here. I will remain. The men who serve me know their place, and that place is below mine." Peasants who worked the land around a castle town knew who governed them. Samurai who garrisoned it knew who owned their loyalty. The castle town itself was the new administrative unit, replacing the old Shogun estate as the node of economic and political life. The Sengoku period had opened the hierarchy, but only a handful of men ever climbed through the gap, and every one of them, without exception, immediately set about closing it behind them. Hideyoshi, who had risen from nothing, codified the separation of farmer and warrior more rigidly than any previous ruler. His sword hunt of 1588 was not merely a policy of disarmament. It was a declaration about who the Japanese state would and would not permit to be dangerous. The men who had weapons were samurai. The men who did not were everyone else. That line, once drawn, was not going to move again. This is what the Sengoku period actually proved. Not that the samurai hierarchy was a fraud that anyone could bypass given sufficient violence, but that the hierarchy was so fundamental to the way Japanese society organized itself that even its destroyers could not imagine replacing it with anything else. The men who broke the old order did not abolish hierarchy. They climbed to its top and then made it permanent. The Sengoku period was the crucible in which the final, rigid Tokugawa version of samurai society was forged, not despite the chaos, but because of it. By the time Tokugawa Ieyasu stood alone after the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Japan had been at war, in various configurations, for over a century. It had consumed thousands of lives, restructured the land, demolished dozens of old families, and elevated dozens of new ones. What it had not done, what it had never come close to doing, was produce a Japan without a ruling class defined by hereditary military status and land rights confirmed from above. The category of samurai had survived the most sustained assault on Japanese hierarchy in history. and its survivors were about to make certain it would never face that kind of assault again. In 1588, Toyotomi Hideyoshi issued an order that redrew the boundaries of Japanese society more decisively than any battle he had ever won. The edict was directed at the peasantry. It was simple, comprehensive, and without precedent at a national scale. Farmers were forbidden to possess swords, short swords, bows, spears, or firearms of any kind. Officials and village headmen across Japan were instructed to collect the weapons and deliver them to Hideyoshi's government. The confiscated metal would be melted down and cast into nails and bolts for the great statue of the Buddha being constructed at the Hoko Temple in Kyoto. The peasants, Hideyoshi's edict explained with elaborate concern, would benefit not only in this life, but in the next. The stated justification was compassion. The real justification was control. Hideyoshi had risen from a peasant family, fought his way through a century of chaos in which armed commoners had overturned lords, monks had raised armies, and village leagues had seized provinces from samurai who had held them for generations. He understood precisely what an armed peasantry could do, because he had watched it done, and in some respects, he had benefited from the instability it created. He had no intention of allowing anyone else the same opportunity. The sword hunt was not a policy of public safety. It was a policy of class. The edict worked not by universal enforcement in some provinces, compliance was partial, and rusted or broken weapons were handed over, while functional ones remained hidden, but by establishing a principle that could be progressively tightened. What mattered was not whether every blade was collected on the first sweep. What mattered was that the state had declared, in writing, with the full weight of national authority behind it, that only certain people were permitted to be dangerous. Those people were samurai. Everyone else was, by definition, a subject rather than a participant in the use of force. 3 years later, in 1591, Hideyoshi reinforced the sword hunt with the Separation Edict, a law that made the new class boundaries legally permanent. Samurai could not become farmers or merchants. Farmers could not abandon their fields for commerce or military service. Merchants and artisans could not move into the villages. Each person was fixed to the category into which they had been born, and movement between categories was prohibited and punishable. The man who had climbed from peasant foot soldier to ruler of all Japan had, in the space of 3 years, made it illegal for anyone to repeat his journey. The separation of farmer and warrior Haino Bunri had economic consequences that would shape the next 2.5 centuries. Before Hideyoshi, samurai had often lived on the land, farming in peacetime and fighting when called. They had local roots, local loyalties, and direct connections to the agricultural economy that sustained them. The Separation Edict required them to choose. Those who chose the sword left the land and moved into the castle towns that the daimyo were now building across the country. They became entirely dependent on their lord, for income no longer landholders in any practical sense, but stipend recipients, paid in rice allowances determined by others and subject to revision at the lord's discretion. This was a structural transformation of enormous consequence, and Hideyoshi almost certainly did not grasp its full implications. By cutting samurai off from the land, he created a class that had no independent economic foundation, a class that could not feed itself without the continued approval of whoever stood above them in the hierarchy. A samurai who lost his lord's favor had nothing to fall back on. A samurai whose domain reduced his stipend could not make up the difference by farming. The warrior class had been given a monopoly on violence and stripped of everything else that might sustain them. The Tokugawa shogunate would inherit this arrangement and make it permanent. Oda Nobunaga had laid the groundwork for all of this, with a characteristic directness that Hideyoshi later refined. Nobunaga had conducted early, localized sword confiscations from the armed peasant leagues, the Iko-Iki, who had been among the most effective opponents of samurai rule in the preceding century. He had reorganized his domain on the basis of centralized land management rather than hereditary stewardship, and had insisted that his retainers choose between military service and agricultural life rather than straddling both. Where Nobunaga pioneered, Hideyoshi systematized. Where Hideyoshi systematized, Tokugawa Ieyasu would freeze. The Taiko Land Survey, conducted across Japan between 1583 and 1598, was the administrative counterpart to the sword hunt. Hideyoshi's officials measured fields, assessed yields, registered cultivators, and established the unit of rice production as the fundamental currency of the political economy. The Kokudaka system tied every domain, every lord, every samurai stipend, and every tax obligation to a measurable quantity of rice. The shogun, the private estate system that had defined Japanese land tenure for 6 centuries, was effectively abolished. In its place was something cleaner, harder, and far more legible to the state. What Hideyoshi had built, across the 1580s and 90s, was a society in which the categories of person were fixed, the instruments of violence were reserved for one category alone, and the economic basis of that category was entirely dependent on the approval of those above it. He died in 1598, leaving a 5-year-old heir and a council of regents to hold what he had made. They could not. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most patient and calculating of all the Sengoku survivors, had spent years positioning himself for the succession struggle that Hideyoshi's death made inevitable. At Sekigahara in 1600, he won it. Everything Hideyoshi had built, the sword hunt, the class separation, the Kokudaka system, the castle towns, the stipend-dependent samurai, passed into Ieyasu's hands. He took all of it, sharpened it, and turned it into something even more durable. The sword hunt had been an act of consolidation. What Ieyasu was about to construct was something altogether more ambitious, a system designed not merely to end the chaos of the Sengoku period, but to make chaos permanently impossible. He would succeed, for 250 years, in ways that Hideyoshi could not have imagined, and that the samurai class itself would come to experience as a kind of suffocation. Tokugawa Ieyasu had watched everyone. He had watched Oda Nobunaga burn his way across Japan and then die at the hands of a trusted general. He had watched Toyotomi Hideyoshi climb from nothing to the summit of Japanese power and then leave a 5-year-old heir who could not hold what he had built. He had spent decades as a subordinate, a hostage, an ally, and a patient observer. When his moment came at Sekigahara in 1600, a battle involving some 170,000 men, resolved in a single morning, he was 60 years old and had outlasted every rival of consequence. He had no intention of making the mistakes he had spent a lifetime studying. In 1603, the emperor appointed Ieyasu Sei Taishogun. 2 years later, Ieyasu resigned the title in favor of his son Hidetada. The resignation was deliberate, and the message it sent was precise. The shogunate belonged to the Tokugawa family, not to Ieyasu personally, and it would pass from father to son regardless of who held the formal position at any given moment. What had destroyed Hideyoshi's regime, a single heir too young to rule, a council of regents who immediately began competing with each other, would not destroy this one. The dynasty was the point, not the man. Ieyasu classified the daimyo with the same precision he applied to everything. Those who had been loyal to him before Sekigahara the Fudai were placed in domains close to the center of power and allowed to hold administrative positions within the shogunate itself. Those who had submitted only after the battle, the Tozama, the outside lords, were given larger domains but placed at the geographic periphery, excluded from the bakufu's offices, and watched. The Shinpan were the Tokugawa relatives, placed in strategic locations as a further layer of insurance. Every territorial arrangement was a political calculation. The map of Edo period Japan was a diagram of Ieyasu's suspicions. In 1615, the last serious threat dissolved in the ruins of Osaka Castle. Toyotomi Hideyori, Hideyoshi's son, the young man Ieyasu had spent a decade maneuvering against, was dead, and the Toyotomi line with him. Ieyasu issued the laws for military houses, the same year regulations that told the daimyo how to govern their domains, how to repair their castles, whom they could marry, and how to conduct themselves as rulers. The laws were partly moral exhortation, partly administrative framework, and entirely an instrument of control. A daimyo who repaired a castle without bakufu approval was breaking the law. A daimyo who arranged a marriage without permission was breaking the law. The shogunate had codified the dependency of the powerful. The four-tier class system, shino, ko, sho, warriors, farmers, artisans, merchants, was the social scaffolding on which everything else rested. Samurai occupied the top tier not because they were the wealthiest, the most numerous, or the most economically productive, but because they held the state's monopoly on legitimate violence and administered the domains that extracted taxes from everyone below them. Farmers ranked second in the formal hierarchy because they produced the rice that the entire economy ran on. Artisans ranked third. Merchants who generated significant wealth without, in the Confucian framework that Tokugawa had adopted, producing anything ranked last. The ranking bore little relationship to actual economic power, and everyone knew it. That gap would widen significantly over the next 2 centuries. The samurai were separated from the land in a way that Hideyoshi had begun but Ieyasu completed. Most samurai moved into the castle towns of their respective domains and received rice stipends determined by their domain's assessed yield, their kokudaka. They no longer farmed. They no longer held land in any practical sense. They were administrators and potential soldiers, living in castle towns, dependent on stipends, governed by a hierarchy that ran from the domain lord up through the shogun, and, nominally, to the emperor in Kyoto, whose authority sanctioned everything above it. The chain was long. Every link had a function. None of the links moved. What Ieyasu had built was a system of mutual constraint so precisely engineered that its component parts could not act against each other without acting against themselves. The daimyo were rich enough to govern, but not rich enough to rebel. Maintaining the Sankin-Kōtai processions and the Edo residences consumed enormous resources. The samurai were armed enough to be useful, but not autonomous enough to be dangerous. Their stipends came from their lords, and their lords' authority came from the shogunate. The shogunate's own authority rested on the emperor's sanction, which the emperor could not withdraw without the shogunate's permission. It was a pyramid of mutual dependency, held together by self-interest and the memory of what a century of unrestrained competition had cost. Ieyasu died in 1616. The regime he had built was, by any historical standard, still dangerously young shogunates and dynasties had collapsed in far less time. His successors Hidetada and then Ieyasu spent the next 3 decades tightening what he had loosened, adding additional layers of regulation, completing the closure of Japan to most foreign contact in the 1630s, and ensuring that by the time of Ieyasu's death in 1651, the Tokugawa system was so deeply embedded in every dimension of Japanese life that dislodging it required not merely military force, but a complete reimagining of what Japan was and should be. The system was built to last. The question no one had quite thought to answer was what it would do to the people inside it. A warrior class, defined by its capacity for violence, placed in permanent peacetime, stripped of land, dependent on stipends, governed by regulations that covered everything from castle repairs to the correct length of a sword that was not a recipe for contentment. It was a recipe for a very particular kind of slow suffocation. The samurai of the Sengoku period had lived in chaos and died by it. The samurai of the Edo period would live in perfect order. They would find across the next 2.5 centuries that perfect order had costs of its own. The settlement that Ieyasu constructed was not a conclusion, it was a compression. The political violence, the ambition, the competition for resources and status that the Sengoku period had expressed in open warfare, all of it was still present inside the Tokugawa system, pressed down beneath the weight of regulation, redistribution, and the enforced peace of a state that had made war between its component parts essentially impossible. 250 years of that compression would produce something the Sengoku warlords could not have imagined. A samurai class that had forgotten how to fight, that was drowning in debt, and that would eventually look at the system designed to protect it and understand that the system had become its cage. The settlement's most consequential feature was not what it prevented, but what it created. By removing war from the samurai's life, Ieyasu had created the central problem of Edo Japan, a class of armed administrators with no war to administer. Sustained by a rice-based economy that would not keep pace with the needs of a society growing in complexity and commercial activity. Every difficulty that followed the debt crises, the intellectual descent, the eventual collapse, was already encoded in the logic of what Ieyasu had settled. He had ended the chaos. He had also started the clock. The emperor in Kyoto continued to receive his formal reverence. The court continued its ceremonies. Imperial sanction continued to legitimize the shogun's authority. But the emperor had no army, no land of consequence, and no mechanism by which he could translate his symbolic sovereignty into actual governance. He was the source of all authority and the holder of none. That arrangement had seemed permanent in 1615. It would not seem permanent in 1850. The men who understood what the arrangement actually was, who had studied it, who had benefited from it, and who had grown up inside it, would be the ones who finally ended it. And they would do so in the emperor's name. The Tokugawa Settlement was the most important moment in samurai history. It did not feel like a moment. It felt like a permanent condition. That was precisely the point. The third Tokugawa shogun, Ieyasu, formalized in 1635 what his grandfather had understood instinctively, that the most effective way to prevent powerful men from acting against you was to keep them poor, watched, and permanently in motion. The Sankin-Kōtai system, alternate attendance, required every daimyo in Japan to spend roughly half his time in Edo, at the shogunate's capital, and the other half governing his home domain. The wife and the eldest son stayed in Edo always. They were never, under any circumstances, permitted to leave. The language of the arrangement was obligation and ceremony. The reality was a hostage system refined to an art form. The processions themselves were the system's most visible expression. A daimyo traveling to Edo did not travel quietly. He was required to arrive with a retinue, proportionate to his domain's assessed rice, yield a demonstration of wealth and status that the shogunate read as evidence of loyalty and order. Processions routinely numbered several hundred attendants and could reach into the thousands for the largest domains. Banners, guards, porters, horses, officials, the entire column moved at walking pace along the great highways, stopping at designated post towns, filling the inns, feeding the local economy, and placing the daimyo under observation for every mile of the journey. Japan's 5 great highways, the Tokaido running along the Pacific coast between Edo and Kyoto, the Nakasindo cutting through the mountains, and 3 others radiating outward, existed partly to enable commerce and communication, but they were built and maintained primarily to manage this system of compulsory movement. 53 post stations lined the Tokaido alone. Check stations inspected traffic, monitored who was traveling and with what, and reported to shogunate inspectors appointed specifically to watch the roads. In 1659, Edo formalized the oversight. Highway inspectors were appointed across the network, reporting directly to bakufu officials. The roads were infrastructure. They were also a surveillance architecture stretched across the entire country. The financial arithmetic of the system was precise and deliberate. Historians estimate that Sankin-Kōtai consumed roughly a quarter of a domain's annual income. The daimyo maintained a residence in his home castle town, a second residence in Edo suitable to his rank, and funded the biannual procession in both directions. The Edo mansion had to be staffed, furnished, and maintained year-round whether the daimyo was there or not. The processions demanded horses, porters, accommodation, food, and the kind of visible display that status made mandatory. Conspicuous frugality was as dangerous as poverty. A daimyo who arrived in Edo with a reduced retinue was advertising weakness. So the spending continued, year after year, decade after decade. The genius of the system was that it never had to be enforced as coercion. It presented itself as ceremony, and ceremony it certainly was, elaborate, ritualized, and culturally significant. The processions were spectacles that local populations lined the roads to watch. They generated trade along every highway in Japan. They created the post-town economy that would sustain rural commerce for 2.5 centuries. They were the arteries of Edo period Japan's cultural and economic circulation. They were also, beneath all of this, a mechanism for preventing anyone outside the Tokugawa family from ever accumulating the resources necessary to challenge it. A daimyo who spent a quarter of his income on attendance obligations, another significant portion on the maintenance of his domain's samurai stipend rolls, and further resources on the infrastructure his domain was required to provide roads, relay stations, harbor maintenance, had very little left for anything that might concern the shogunate. That was the point. A domain financially committed to these obligations could not, in practice, raise and equip the kind of army that a Sengoku-era campaign would have required. The daimyo were not imprisoned. They were simply made too busy, too watched, and too broke to rebel. The wives and sons in Edo were the system's most candid admission of its own nature. No official document called them hostages. The word used was kinship, attendance, honor. But the rule was absolute. They did not leave the city. If a daimyo's heir died in Edo, the domain sent another. If a daimyo's wife died in Edo, protocol required careful negotiation before any replacement could be brought in. The families lived in considerable comfort, maintained large households, participated in the cultural life of the capital, and remained, without exception, under the shogunate's effective custody for as long as the system functioned. Edo itself was the system's most extraordinary product. In 1600, when Ieyasu established his headquarters there, it was a fishing settlement of modest size clustered around the ruins of an old castle. By the early 1700s, it had become one of the largest cities in the world, a metropolis of perhaps 1 million people, sustained in large part by the constant flow of daimyo households, retinues, and the merchant economy that had grown up to service them. The samurai quarter around the castle was vast. The roads leading into the city were among the most heavily trafficked in Asia. A city of that scale had not been planned. It had been summoned, inadvertently, by a political mechanism designed to keep powerful men under control. The great irony of Sankin-Kōtai was that in impoverishing the daimyo, it accelerated the very commercial economy that would eventually undermine the entire class structure the Tokugawa had built. The money the daimyo spent on Edo residences, processions, and ceremonies went somewhere. It went into the hands of merchants, innkeepers, provisioners, craftsmen, and traders. The commercial classes that the Confucian hierarchy ranked at the bottom of society were the ones actually accumulating wealth from the top of it. Rice stipends flowed from domains. They were converted into cash in Edo. The cash moved into the merchant economy. The daimyo and their samurai retainers were the mechanism by which Tokugawa Japan pumped money into exactly the class it most theoretically despised. The system endured for more than 2 centuries before Edo's political crisis forced its suspension in 1862. For 10 generations of daimyo, it was simply the condition of their lives, a rhythm of travel, residence, ceremony, and return that structured the year as reliably as the seasons. For 10 generations of Edo officials, it was the central instrument of political management, the mechanism by which a shogunate governing 300 domains maintained something approaching coherent national control without the constant threat of military challenge. It was coercion so completely absorbed into cultural practice that the men it constrained could no longer imagine a world in which it did not exist. That inability to imagine an alternative was perhaps the system's greatest achievement. After the siege of Osaka Castle in 1615, the last serious military challenge to Tokugawa authority, Japan settled into a peace that would last, with minor disruptions, for 2.5 centuries. No major war, no succession crisis resolved by armies, no daimyo coalition strong enough to challenge the shogunate in the field. The mechanisms Ieyasu had built held, and the samurai, who constituted somewhere between 7 and 10% of Japan's population, somewhere around 1.5 to 2 million people, were left with a fundamental problem they had no framework to address. They were a warrior class. There was nothing to fight. The sword remained. The two swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi, were the most visible markers of samurai status, the one privilege that distinguished them, physically and legally, from every other person they passed on the street. A farmer could not carry them. A merchant could not carry them. The swords told the world what a man was before he had spoken a word. And yet the swords, across 2.5 centuries of enforced peace, were almost never drawn in earnest. They were status objects. They were symbols. They were, increasingly, expensive and beautifully crafted demonstrations of a function that the state had made essentially redundant. What samurai actually did in Edo Japan was administer. A daimyo's domain was a complex bureaucratic organism: tax collection, record-keeping, the adjudication of disputes between farmers, the management of domain finances, the maintenance of roads and irrigation works, the oversight of domain schools. All of it required men who could read, write, calculate, and correspond. The samurai class, placed at the top of the social hierarchy and prohibited from farming or commerce, filled these roles by default. Senior retainers, the karo, served as something close to cabinet ministers, advising the daimyo on domain governance. Middle-ranking samurai staffed the administrative offices. Lower-ranking samurai guarded gates, patrolled castle towns, and kept the kind of order that their ancestors had once imposed with armies. The paperwork was real, and it was relentless. Domain archives from the Edo period survive in extraordinary volume: registers of tax assessments, correspondence between domain officials and the shogunate, records of land surveys, minutes of domain councils, reports on weather and harvests. Samurai wrote these documents, copied them, filed them, referenced them, and disputed them. A man whose great-grandfather had ridden to battle under the Sengoku banners of a powerful warlord might spend his own mornings copying rice yield assessments in neat columns, then spend his afternoons checking them against the previous year's register to confirm there were no discrepancies. This was the inheritance. This was what the warrior class had become. The gap between identity and reality generated a particular kind of anxiety. A samurai in the Edo period was raised from childhood with the understanding that his class existed to fight, that the sword was his purpose, loyalty to his lord, his duty, and death in service his highest possible end. The military texts he studied, the martial arts he practiced, the stories and histories his domain school taught him, all pointed toward a vocation that the world around him had made structurally unnecessary. The training continued. The sword exercises, the archery, the horsemanship, these were maintained as discipline, as cultural expression, and as an insistence that the identity remained real even when the function had evaporated. The stipend system deepened the trap. A samurai's income was set by his rank, and his domain's assessed rice yield a figure that had been fixed, in most cases, at the beginning of the Edo period, and revised downward over time as domains struggled with finances. Stipends were paid in rice, or in cash calculated from the rice price, but the rice price fluctuated while the stipends did not. A century into the Tokugawa peace, many domains were cutting stipends sometimes by a third, sometimes by half to balance their accounts. Samurai, who had been living marginally on their allocations, found themselves suddenly living on even less in a castle town where the cost of maintaining the appearance their status demanded had not fallen at all. The debts followed. The merchant class that the Confucian hierarchy ranked at the bottom of society had become the essential financial infrastructure of the samurai class at the top. A samurai who needed cash before his next rice allocation sold his stipend rice to a merchant broker at a discount because he needed the money now and the merchant could wait. The broker accumulated the rice, converted it at market price, and pocketed the difference. Over decades, generations of samurai households did this, and the gap between what the stipend was worth and what the family owed grew wider. By the 1700s, many samurai were functionally in debt to the very class they were supposed to stand above. The writer Seifu Murata, composing around 1770, captured the reality with a directness that the period's official ideology, could not quite accommodate. Samurai had been suffering from poverty for years, he wrote. Their minds were occupied entirely with making a living. Buy this, sell that, pawn this, to pay for that. That was all their lives had become. Even wives of samurai earning 200 koku, he noted, busied themselves in trade and shops. The warrior class had not abandoned its identity. It had simply been driven by the arithmetic of fixed stipends and rising prices into the economic practices that its identity most formally despised. The Ronin masterless samurai occupied the sharpest edge of the paradox. A samurai who lost his lord through death, disgrace, or domain dissolution lost his stipend and his position simultaneously. He retained his swords, his status, and his training. He had nowhere to apply any of them in the way his upbringing had promised. Some found work as martial arts teachers. Some served as private guards for merchants who could afford their fees. Some drifted into the gray economy of Edo's entertainment districts and gambling quarters. Occupying the intersection between the samurai's legal right to violence and the city's demand for men willing to use it discreetly, the Ronin were not an anomaly in Edo, Japan. They were the warrior class's logical product men defined by a function the state had abolished, surviving as best they could in the gap between what they were supposed to be and what the world permitted. And yet something held. The identity did not collapse, even under the weight of irrelevance, debt, and administrative tedium. The swords remained at the hip. The martial practices continued in the dojos of the castle towns. The literature of the warrior way, the texts that described how a samurai should think, act, and die, circulated and were read seriously. What had no outlet in the world was being transformed, slowly, into something else, a cultural ideal, a set of values detached from battlefield application and reattached to the requirements of peacetime administration. The warrior class was inventing a peacetime version of itself, under the pressure of 2.5 centuries of having no war to fight. That reinvention would not save the class. But the myth it generated would outlast it by centuries. The Edo Paradox was this. The samurai survived 2.5 centuries of peace, not by becoming irrelevant, but by becoming indispensable to an administrative system that could not have functioned without them, while simultaneously becoming financially dependent on the class they legally outranked, culturally anxious about an identity they could not exercise, and collectively unprepared for the moment when the world outside the Tokugawa settlement came looking for Japan and found a warrior class that had spent 10 generations doing paperwork. That moment was coming. The outside world had not been consulted on Japan's preferred arrangement, and when it arrived, it would not be politely turned away. The rice economy that sustained Edo Japan was elegant in theory and punishing in practice. Tax rice flowed upward from the fields collected from farmers, delivered to domain storehouses, assessed against the kokudaka figures that had been set at the beginning of the Tokugawa period. From those storehouses it went to the samurai in the form of stipends, allocated by rank and domain, and from the samurai, who needed cash rather than rice for the daily transactions of city life, it passed into the hands of the merchant brokers, who could convert one into the other at a price that the brokers set, and the samurai had no practical means to contest. The conversion was where the wealth transferred. A samurai entitled to receive a stipend of, say, 200 koku of rice needed that rice turned into cash to pay for his household's needs in a castle town where almost nothing was sold for grain. He sold forward, promising next season's stipend to a broker now in exchange for cash today. The broker, who could store rice indefinitely and sell it when the market favored him, paid less than the rice's eventual market value. That difference, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of samurai transactions over 2.5 centuries, was the foundation of the merchant class's accumulating capital. The rice belonged to the samurai by right. The money it generated belonged, in practice, to the men who handled it. Osaka was the city where this reality was most legible. By the 1720s, Osaka merchants controlled the movement of the overwhelming majority of Japan's nationally traded rice. The domains, even the great Tozuma domains of western Japan, with their hundreds of thousands of koku in assessed yields, maintained warehouse complexes in Osaka where their tax rice was stored and sold. Merchant brokers in the Dojima district handled the transactions, issued paper bills against the stored rice, and traded those bills among themselves in a market that, by 1730, had become the world's first functioning futures exchange. The shogunate in Edo set political policy. The merchants in Osaka set the price of rice. The two facts were not formally in tension. In practice, the second constrained the first in ways the shogunate spent the rest of its existence trying to correct. The Mitsui family built their fortune on precisely this structural opportunity. Beginning as sake brewers and money changers in the 1600s, they expanded into dry goods, then into the handling of currency exchange between different domains. Each domain issued its own paper notes, creating a constant need for conversion services that only experienced merchants could provide. By the 1700s, the Mitsui were operating branches across Japan, managing the financial affairs of daimyo who could not balance their own accounts, and handling government currency exchange contracts for the shogunate itself. A family that the Confucian hierarchy ranked below artisans and farmers was financially indispensable to the government that enforced that hierarchy. The samurai's relationship with merchants was defined by a contradiction that everyone experienced and no one could quite resolve. The samurai held the legal monopoly on violence. The merchants held the actual money. The samurai could, in theory, cut down a merchant who failed to show appropriate deference. The right was legally recognized in some domains. In practice, a samurai who destroyed his creditor destroyed his own financial lifeline. The debt relationship generated a mutual dependency that the formal hierarchy refused to acknowledge and that daily life could not avoid. Samurai needed merchants to eat. Merchants needed samurai not to kill them. Both sides understood the terms and maintained the pretense that the hierarchy remained intact. The sumptuary laws were the state's most explicit admission that the gap between formal rank and economic reality had become visible enough to require management. Repeated edicts across the Edo period restricted what merchants could wear, what materials their houses could use, what entertainments they could stage, and what foods they could eat. A merchant who wore silk, a material reserved for samurai, was breaking the law regardless of whether he could afford 20 suits of it. The laws were enforced unevenly and defied constantly, and the defiance was not always subtle. One Osaka merchant family, the Yodoya, had grown so wealthy by the late 1600s that they converted a room in their house into an aquarium lit by a glass ceiling. The government eventually confiscated the family's assets on grounds of sumptuary violation. The assets confiscated were estimated at the equivalent of the shogunate's entire annual revenue. The domains themselves were trapped in the same dynamic as their samurai retainers, only at a larger scale. A domain's assessed rice yield was fixed. Its obligations, stipend rolls, Sankin-Kōtai expenses, domain infrastructure, were fixed or growing. The gap between income and obligation widened as the Edo period extended, and the gap was bridged by borrowing from merchant houses. By the mid-1800s, most domains carried debts running to decades of annual revenue. Some had simply rolled their loans forward indefinitely, paying interest on interest, with no realistic prospect of ever clearing the principal. The merchant lenders had no legal recourse. There was no court in Tokugawa Japan where a merchant could successfully sue a samurai domain for debt recovery, but they held something more durable than legal rights. They held the credit lines that kept the domains functioning. Cutting them off was not an option anyone seriously considered. The domain of Hirosaki in northern Honshu illustrates the arithmetic as clearly as any other. By the 1750s, after a century of harvest difficulties and 2 rounds of stipend cuts that had reduced retainer incomes by half, Hirosaki owed merchant creditors more than 300,000 ryo, a sum that exceeded double the domain's entire annual tax revenue. Hirosaki was not unusual. It was typical. Across Japan, the same story played out in different proportions. Domains in structural deficit, samurai stipends declining in real value, merchant wealth accumulating behind a formal hierarchy that insisted the merchants were the least important people in the country. The logic of the rice economy had one further perversity that the shogunate found particularly maddening. The dojima futures market meant that the price of rice, the fundamental unit of economic value in the entire Tokugawa system, was set not by the state or by agricultural production, but by speculation. When speculators drove the price down, samurai whose income was denominated in rice found themselves with less purchasing power than their stipend figures suggested. When famines drove the price up, the rice in domain storehouses was worth more, but the samurai's fixed cash needs remained the same, and the difference still went to the brokers. The system was optimized at every point for the transfer of economic surplus from the warrior class to the commercial class it officially despised. The shogunate tried repeatedly to correct this. Edicts canceled samurai debts to merchants, which simply destroyed the willingness of merchants to lend, creating immediate credit crises in the domains that depended on that lending. Price floors were set for rice, which distorted the market in ways that produced shortages. Merchant guilds were dissolved, which disrupted the distribution networks that fed the cities. Every intervention produced a consequence that required another intervention. The underlying structural problem, a warrior class sustained by an agricultural economy while living in an increasingly commercial world, was not something that could be corrected by edict. It required a different kind of solution. It required, eventually, the kind of thinking that comes from inside a class that has spent generations watching the ground beneath it shift. By the early 19th century, the writer Seifu Murata's observation from the 1770s had become so obviously true that the shogunate's official ideology could barely contain it. The samurai were poor, the merchants were rich. The Confucian hierarchy said one thing, the economy said another. The men who would eventually dismantle the Tokugawa system were already growing up in castle towns where their fathers borrowed from chonin to cover household expenses, where the domain school taught the importance of the warrior way, while the domain itself was in permanent debt to rice brokers, and where the swords their class wore as its defining symbol had not been drawn in anger, by most of their bearers, in living memory. The sharpest critics of the Tokugawa order were not merchants frustrated by their legal subordination, not farmers crushed under rice taxes, not the disinherited sons of failed domains. They were samurai, men who had grown up inside the system, been educated by it, served it, and then sat down to write what they had observed. The critique of the Tokugawa settlement did not come from outside looking in. It came from inside, from men who understood the machinery precisely because they were part of it, and who could not reconcile what the machinery was supposed to do with what they watched it doing every day. Ogyu Sorai was born in 1666, the son of a physician serving the Tokugawa court. He grew up in conditions of genuine poverty after his father was posted to a provincial backwater, and he spent his formative years dependent on the charity of neighbors while educating himself on whatever texts he could access. When he finally established himself as a scholar and writer in Edo, he brought to his analysis of the Tokugawa system a combination of Confucian learning and direct personal experience of what it meant to be a samurai household without adequate resources. What he saw, he wrote about with unusual candor. The natural hierarchy of Japanese society was being inverted. The daimyo had grown sedentary and debauched in Edo. The merchant class was accumulating the wealth that the warrior class was spending on display. The system was producing moral decay, and moral decay in Sorai's Confucian framework was the precursor to political collapse. Sorai's proposed remedy was radical in its implications, if conservative in its framing. He suggested returning the samurai to the land. The separation of warrior from agricultural base that Hideyoshi had begun and Ieyasu had completed was, in Sorai's analysis, the root cause of everything wrong with the Edo order. A samurai who lived on a stipend in a castle town had no stake in the land, no roots in his community, no connection to the agricultural reality that the entire economy depended upon. Return the warriors to the villages, give them direct relationships with the land they theoretically governed, and the stipend dependency with all its debt, humiliation, and distraction would resolve itself. The shogunate found the proposal interesting, discussed it at length, and did not act on it. The system Sorai was critiquing was also the system that employed him. What mattered about Sorai was not the remedy, but the diagnosis. He had identified the structural fault of the Tokugawa settlement from within it, the point at which the system's design produced consequences that the system's ideology refused to acknowledge. The samurai were supposed to be the moral backbone of Japanese society. In practice, they were increasingly its most financially precarious members. The merchants were supposed to be the least important class. In practice, they were the class that kept everyone else solvent. Sorai named this contradiction clearly, early, and at a moment when it was still possible to argue that it was correctable. Later thinkers would conclude it was not. The Mito school arrived at its conclusions through a different route. Mito domain, in what is now Ibaraki Prefecture, had been granted to a branch of the Tokugawa family and had spent much of the Edo period engaged in an ambitious historical project, the compilation of the Dai Nihon Shi, a comprehensive history of Japan from the first emperors to the present. The project took generations and was never completed in the Edo period. But the act of writing it had a political consequence its originators had not fully anticipated. To write Japan's history from the perspective of the imperial line was to write a history in which the shogunate was, structurally, a temporary arrangement, a delegation of authority from the emperor to a military administrator, revocable in principle at the emperor's will. Aizawa Seishisai, a Mito scholar writing in 1825, gave the school's political implications their most famous formulation in the work known as the Shinran, the New Discourse. Aizawa introduced into modern Japanese political writing the phrase "sono joi," revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. His immediate concern was the growing Western presence in East Asian waters and the shogunate's apparent inability to respond to it with adequate firmness. But the deeper argument was structural. The shogun governed in the emperor's name. If the shogun failed to protect Japan, failed to discharge the military function, that was the entire justification for the shogunate's existence, then the delegation of authority had not been honored. The emperor's moral primacy was absolute. The shogunate's authority was contingent. That distinction had always been present in the system's logic. Aizawa made it explicit. Tokugawa Nariaki, the daimyo of Mito from 1829, embodied the school's political contradictions. He was a Tokugawa, a member of the family whose authority his own domain's scholars were quietly but systematically undermining. He was also a fierce critic of the shogunate's handling of Japan's growing foreign policy crisis, demanding more military preparedness, more coastal fortifications, more resolve in the face of Western encroachment. He promoted Mito school ideas, founded the Kodokan Academy to spread them, and repeatedly criticized the shogunate's conciliatory approach to the foreign threat. A Tokugawa domain lord was providing the intellectual infrastructure for an argument that would eventually destroy Tokugawa rule. The samurai class was, at the highest levels, producing its own most dangerous critics. Yoshida Shoin arrived at the same destination by a more direct path. Born in 1830 into a low-ranking samurai family in the Choshu domain, he received a military education, became a student of Western military science, and responded to Commodore Perry's arrival in Japan in 1853 with a solution so direct, it was almost absurd. He attempted to stow away on one of Perry's ships to learn Western military technology from. The source: he was caught, imprisoned, and stripped of his samurai status and his stipend. Under house arrest, he opened a small school in Hagi and began teaching the young men of Choshu. What Shoin taught was not merely military science or Confucian ethics. He taught that the shogunate had failed, that it had demonstrated, in its response to Perry, that it could not protect Japan, and that an institution which could not perform its defining function had forfeited its claim to govern. The emperor was the legitimate sovereign. The shogunate was an agent that had exceeded its commission. This was the Mito school's argument sharpened to an edge. Shoin was executed in 1859, at the age of 29, by a shogunate that understood exactly how dangerous the argument was. Among the students who survived him were the men who would lead the Meiji Restoration: Ito Hirobumi, Kido Takayoshi, Yamagata Aritomo. The teacher's death did not end the lesson. It confirmed it. What the samurai intellectual tradition had accomplished, across the century and a half between Sorai's economic critique and Shoin's political martyrdom, was something remarkable and essentially paradoxical. A class defined by its service to the Tokugawa order had produced, from within itself, the most coherent intellectual case for that order's illegitimacy. The arguments were made using the system's own vocabulary: Confucian ethics, imperial loyalty, the obligations of the warrior class to the society it governed. Every critique reproduced the value framework of the thing being critiqued. That was what made it so difficult to dismiss and so dangerous to suppress. The system was diagnosing itself using the only language it had ever been given, and the diagnosis, by the middle of the 19th century, was terminal. The men who would eventually act on these diagnoses were mostly low or middling-ranking samurai men with the education to understand the system's contradictions, and the marginal position within it to have less to lose from. Challenging them, they had grown up reading the texts that named the problem. They had watched their fathers borrow from merchants and their domains stagger under debt. They had practiced sword arts in a world that no longer needed swords. When the moment came, when the outside world arrived in Edo Harbor in 1853, and the shogunate's response revealed exactly the paralysis the critics had described, they were already prepared. The class that the Tokugawa system had built to defend itself had spent 2 generations quietly thinking through the reasons it should not. On the 8th of July, 1853, 4 American warships entered Edo Bay. 2 were steam-powered paddle-wheel frigates that moved without wind, trailing columns of black smoke against the summer sky. The Japanese called them Kurofune, the black ships. They had never seen vessels like them. The guns were real and pointed at the city. The message was simple: the outside world was here, and it had no interest in the arrangements the Tokugawa shogunate had made to keep it out for 2.5 centuries. Commodore Matthew Perry's orders were to open Japan to American trade. He had enough firepower to make refusal costly, and he knew it. So did everyone watching from the shore. The shogunate that received Perry's letter from President Fillmore was already under structural strain before the black ships arrived. The stipend crisis, the merchant debt, the intellectual ferment of the Medo school and its satellites, all of it was present and worsening. What Perry's arrival did was apply an external pressure to a system that had been stressing internally for decades and reveal, in a single afternoon of black smoke and gun muzzles in Edo Harbor, that the institution charged with protecting Japan from exactly this kind of threat had no credible means of doing so. The coastal defense fortifications the shogunate had been discussing for years were not built. The navy that could have met Perry at sea did not exist. The samurai class, trained for centuries in sword and bow, had no answer for steam-powered artillery at close range. The shogunate's chief senior counselor, Abe Masahiro, faced an impossible set of choices. Military resistance was almost certainly suicidal. Complete capitulation would destroy the shogunate's domestic authority. He chose the middle path: accept Perry's letter, delay the response, and buy time. He also made a decision that would prove consequential in ways he could not have anticipated. For the first time in Tokugawa history, he polled the daimyo for their opinions on how to respond. The results were divided and largely useless of the responses that came back. Roughly half favored acceptance and half opposed it, but the act of asking had already changed something. The shogunate had admitted that it needed guidance. An institution that needed guidance was not an institution that controlled events. Perry returned in February 1854 with 8 warships and the clear implication that polite delay had run its course. The Treaty of Kanagawa was signed on the 31st of March. 2 ports, Shimoda and Hakodate, were open to American ships for supplies and limited trade. An American consul would be permitted in Japan. The 2.5 centuries of sakoku, the closed country policy that had been one of the Tokugawa settlement's defining features, was over. Japan had not chosen to open. Japan had been opened by force of a technological gap so wide that the men who had spent their lives training with swords could do nothing about it except watch. What followed was not a single crisis, but a cascade. Within 4 years, the American consul Townsend Harris had extracted far more comprehensive terms. The Harris Treaty of 1858, which opened additional ports, established fixed, low tariffs that Japan could not alter, and granted American citizens extraterritoriality, meaning they were subject to American courts rather than Japanese law, even for crimes committed on Japanese soil. Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands signed similar treaties within weeks. Japan's sovereignty, which the Tokugawa system had maintained in complete and undisputed form for 2.5 centuries, had been partially ceded to a series of Western powers without, critically, the emperor's approval. That last detail was the system's fracture point. Naosuke, who had been elevated to the position of Taro Chief Elder, the most powerful office in the shogunate, had signed the Harris Treaty in July 1858, despite the reigning emperor's explicit objection. He had done so because the alternative, watching British and French warships arrive and impose worse terms at gunpoint, as they had just finished doing to China in the Arrow War, seemed worse. He was probably right as a matter of practical politics, but the act of signing an agreement that the emperor had refused to sanction, in a system that derived its entire legitimacy from imperial authorization, was a gift to every critic the Meiji school had been training for decades. The shogunate had not merely failed to protect Japan, it had overridden the emperor to fail more conveniently. Naosuke's response to the criticism was the Ansei Purge, a systematic suppression of opposition that ran from 1858 to 1860 and resulted in the arrest, exile, or execution of over 100 opponents, including daimyo, court nobles, and samurai intellectuals from the Meiji school. Yoshida Shoin died in it. So did dozens of others. The purge was effective in the short term and catastrophic in the longer. It removed the most vocal critics but confirmed everything they had been arguing. An institution that could only maintain authority by executing samurai who questioned it was demonstrating exactly the illegitimacy its victims had been documenting. Naosuke was assassinated on the 24th of March, 1860, at the Sakuradamon Gate of Edo Castle. 18 Meiji domain samurai, most of them ronin, masterless men who had sacrificed their status for the act, attacked his procession in a snowstorm. He died in his palanquin before his guards could respond. The most powerful man in the Tokugawa shogunate had been killed in broad daylight at the entrance to its own castle by the class that the shogunate existed to govern. The message was as clear as anything Perry had delivered in Edo Harbor. The world inside the Tokugawa settlement was no longer stable. The Sano-Jōi movement, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians that spread through the samurai class in the years after Ie's assassination, was not a coherent political program. It was an emotion and a direction. The emotion was fury at the humiliation of the unequal treaties and the shogunate's apparent inability to reverse them. The direction was toward the emperor, the one figure whose legitimacy the Tokugawa system itself had always acknowledged as absolute. The slogan contained a built-in contradiction that its adherents mostly chose not to examine. The barbarians could not, in 1858, be expelled. Japan had no navy that could expel them. Anyone who actually understood Western military capability, and the more sophisticated samurai intellectuals had been studying it since Perry's arrival, knew that Sano-Jōi, as a military proposition, was suicidal. As a political proposition, however, it was enormously powerful. The contradiction resolved itself, gradually and violently, in the direction of the political rather than the military reading. The samurai who had initially mobilized around expelling the West came, through a series of domain-level military encounters with Western ships in the early 1860s that demonstrated the catastrophic cost of actual combat, to understand that the question was not whether to engage with the West, but how. The more they studied Western military organization, the more clearly they could see that Japan's problem was not cultural or moral, it was structural. a feudal system in which military resources were distributed across 300 independent domains, none of which could coordinate with the others without the permission of a discredited shogunate, could not defend a nation against industrial powers that had been consolidating military capacity for a century. The solution they arrived at was one that the Meiji school had been circling for decades: a centralized state, under the emperor, with a national army. What the Sano-Joi movement had started as an argument for cultural purity, it was ending as an argument for modernization. The class that had been defined by its resistance to change was about to become the instrument of the most rapid transformation in Japan's history. The shogunate, watching this, had no adequate response. It attempted reform naval training schools with Dutch instructors, translations of Western military texts, experimental engagement with Western technology. All of it was too slow, too partial, and too dependent on the cooperation of domains that were increasingly looking past the shogunate to the emperor in Kyoto. The institution that had been built to make the chaos of the Sengoku period permanently impossible had produced, through 2.5 centuries of perfect stasis, a ruling class that was simultaneously the most educated group in Japan and the most marginalized by the system. It served men with no land, dwindling stipends, practiced swords, and an urgent, burning sense that the country they had sworn to protect was being managed into catastrophe by people who had forgotten what governance was actually for. The story most often told about the Meiji Restoration is a story about modernization, a feudal Japan cracking open under Western pressure and rebuilding itself as a modern state. That story is true as far as it goes. But it flattens something essential about what actually happened in 1868. The men who overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate were not merchants demanding free trade, or peasants demanding land reform, or Western powers imposing a new order. They were samurai. Low-ranking samurai from domains that had been on the losing side at Sekigahara 2.5 centuries earlier, who had spent those centuries watching the upper reaches of the Tokugawa system drain the country's resources and govern it into paralysis. The Meiji Restoration was, at its core, a class struggle within the samurai class. Okubo Toshimichi was born in 1830 in Kagoshima, in the Satsuma domain, the eldest son of a low-ranking vassal who protected the daimyo's household. He studied at the same local school as Saigō Takamori, 3 years his senior. He began his career as an assistant clerk, managing the kind of minor administrative work that the lower rungs of the samurai hierarchy performed by default. He was not a member of the domain's governing councils. He was not connected to the great families who managed Satsuma's affairs. He was a capable young man from an unremarkable background who understood the domain's internal politics with unusual clarity, and who had begun to see, by the late 1850s, that the Tokugawa order was not going to be reformed from within. Kido Takayoshi came from Choshu, the domain in western Japan that would become the other pillar of the anti-shogunate movement. Born in 1833 as the son of a physician, he had been adopted into a samurai family and educated in the martial and literary arts that the domain school provided. He served as a liaison between the domain bureaucracy and the younger, more radical samurai of Choshu who had absorbed Yoshida Shoin's teaching before Shoin's execution. Kido was not himself from the domain's upper tier. He was a middle-ranking man of considerable intelligence who understood that the existing order, not merely the Tokugawa shogunate but the entire distribution of power within the samurai class, was the obstacle. Ito Hirobumi was younger, born in 1841, the son of a farmer who had been adopted into a low-ranking samurai family. He had been one of Yoshida Shoin's students at the small school in Hagi. After Shoin's execution, he had participated in extremist activities, including an attempt, with others, to burn down the British legation in Edo, before coming to understand, through direct exposure to Western military capability, that the Sano-Joi program was strategically impossible. What he took from that understanding was not despair but a different ambition. Japan needed to master what the West had built. He would eventually become Japan's first prime minister and the architect of the Meiji Constitution. He arrived at that position from a farming background, through a dead teacher, a failed arson attempt, and a complete revision of his political thinking. These men shared a characteristic that was not incidental to their eventual success. They were all too marginal within the existing samurai hierarchy to have a strong personal stake in preserving it. A high-ranking hereditary counselor of a great domain had everything to lose from dismantling the system that had defined his family's position for generations. A low-ranking retainer who had risen by ability rather than birth, who had watched his domain's finances collapse under the weight of stipend rolls and Edo residence costs, who had seen the shogunate capitulate to Perry and sign the Harris Treaty without imperial sanction. He had considerably less to protect and considerably more to gain from a fundamental restructuring. The Sacho Alliance, the secret agreement forged in 1866 between the Satsuma and Choshu domains, was the operational core of what became the Meiji Restoration. Satsuma and Choshu had been enemies for decades. They were united by their position as Tozama domains, the outside lords who had submitted to the Tokugawa only after Sekigahara and had been kept at the political periphery, denied the administrative offices, and subjected to the heaviest surveillance ever since. Their grievance against the upper Tokugawa structure was structural and institutional, not merely personal. Okubo and Saigō negotiated for Satsuma. Kido negotiated for Choshu. Sakamoto Ryoma, a lower-ranking Tosa samurai who had given up his status to operate outside any domain structure, brokered the meeting. The alliance was not between daimyo. It was between the capable men who had risen within those domains despite, not because of, the existing hierarchy. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the last shogun, resigned in November 1867 under pressure from the allied domains. He made the calculation correctly that the military balance had shifted against the shogunate, and that a negotiated transfer was preferable to a war he could not guarantee winning. On the 3rd of January 1868, Satsuma forces entered the imperial palace in Kyoto and declared the restoration of direct imperial rule under the 15-year-old Emperor Mutsuhito. The Tokugawa system, built by Ieyasu to be permanent, had lasted 264 years. It did not end because foreigners dismantled it. It ended because the men the system had trained and marginalized dismantled it themselves. What followed was not merely a change of government. It was a systematic dismantling of everything the Tokugawa Settlement had constructed. In 1869, the daimyo of the leading anti-shogunate domains were persuaded to return their land registers to the emperor. Other daimyo followed. In 1871, all remaining domains were abolished. The roughly 300 han that had constituted the administrative structure of Edo Japan were replaced by prefectures, each governed by a centrally appointed official answerable to the new Meiji government in Tokyo. 2.5 centuries of domain autonomy, the structure that had sustained samurai stipend rolls, preserved daimyo power, and made any genuinely centralized Japanese state impossible, was dissolved in a single imperial edict. The men who announced it had assembled 8,000 soldiers from Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa in Tokyo before making the announcement. The critical revisionist argument about what this moment was needs to be stated directly. The abolition of the samurai system was not something imposed on samurai by an outside force. It was designed and executed by samurai who understood precisely what they were doing and why. Okubo Toshimichi, himself a samurai, was its principal architect. Kido Takayoshi, himself a samurai, had insisted on the necessity of abolishing domains from the first year of Meiji. The men they were dismantling were not their social inferiors. They were the daimyo, the hereditary senior counselors, the great families of the Tokugawa order, the upper samurai, the men at the top of the class whose privilege had been purchased by the subordination and impoverishment of everyone below them. The abolition of the samurai class was a class struggle, prosecuted by the lower and middling ranks against the upper ranks, fought in the emperor's name with the vocabulary of national modernization. The conscript army announced in 1873 completed the argument. Yamagata Aritomo, another Choshu samurai, another of Yoshida Shoin's intellectual descendants, designed the new national military on the model of Western conscript forces. Any Japanese man, regardless of social origin, could serve. The samurai monopoly on state violence, the foundation of the entire system that stretched back to Hideyoshi's sword hunt and beyond, was formally abolished. A farmer's son could now be a soldier. A merchant's son could now be a soldier. The thing that had defined the samurai class more than anything else, the exclusive right to be dangerous on the state's behalf, was made available to every Japanese man with a functioning body and the age to carry a rifle. The men who had built the new state understood that they had done something structurally radical, even as they wrapped it in the language of restoration and tradition. The emperor had been restored. But the emperor had always been there, performing ceremonies and sanctioning the governance of whoever held actual power. What had changed was the identity of the class that held that power, the mechanism by which that class recruited its members, and the relationship between military capacity and social status that the entire Tokugawa order had been built to freeze permanently in place. A class that had defined itself by inherited privilege had been replaced by one that would, at least in aspiration, define itself by competence. Japan's samurai had not been abolished by history. They had been abolished by other samurai who had read history more carefully. The emotional weight of this process was not lost on the people inside it. Kido Takayoshi's diary reveals a man in constant internal conflict between loyalty to Choshu, the domain that had formed him, and the national project that required him to dissolve it. He wrote of having to fight rumors at home that he had betrayed his old friends. The idea of Japan as a nation, rather than a collection of domains, was still relatively new, and most samurai cared more about securing advantages for their own domain than for any abstract national interest. The men who built the Meiji state were not free of these tensions. They acted through them, convinced that the alternative, a Japan that preserved its feudal structure in the face of an industrializing world, would not survive to argue about it. Saigō Takamori was born in 1828 in Kagoshima, the son of a low-ranking samurai in the Satsuma domain. He was large, physically imposing in a way that people who met him consistently remarked upon, and he possessed a quality of personal magnetism that attracted followers across every faction of the turbulent decades through which he moved. He had served the Satsuma daimyo faithfully, been twice exiled to the Amami Islands for insubordination and political inconvenience, twice recalled because Satsuma could not manage without him, and emerged from both exiles with his reputation enhanced rather than diminished. He had negotiated the Sacho alliance. He had commanded the imperial forces that received the bloodless surrender of Edo Castle in 1868. He was, by any measure, one of the 3 or 4 men most responsible for the Meiji Restoration's success. He had also, from the beginning, been ambivalent about what the Restoration was actually building. While Okubo Toshimichi and Kido Takayoshi were absorbed in the work of constructing a centralized modern state, abolishing domains, redesigning tax systems, building railways, sending missions to Europe to study Western institutions, Saigō kept returning to Kagoshima. He held office in the new Meiji government reluctantly and intermittently. He opposed the railway, arguing the money would be better spent strengthening the military. He was uneasy about conscription, which dissolved the boundary between warrior and commoner that his entire life had been built around. He watched the Japan he had helped create, becoming something he had not intended to create. The break came in 1873 over the Korea question. Korea had refused to recognize Emperor Meiji as head of state, expelling Japanese envoys in terms that Saigō and others considered an intolerable insult. Saigō proposed being sent to Korea himself as an envoy. Not a diplomatic mission, precisely, but a deliberate provocation. He fully expected to be assassinated, and he expected that assassination to give Japan its justification for war. The argument he was making, beneath the foreign policy surface, was about the domestic crisis of the samurai class. A war with Korea would give the samurai purpose. It would absorb the tens of thousands of men who had been stripped of their stipends, their status, and their function by the Meiji reforms, and it would give them something the reforms had taken away: a reason to draw their swords. Okubo blocked it. He had just returned from the Iwakura mission, the extended study tour of Western countries that had convinced him, beyond any remaining doubt, that Japan's survival in the modern world depended on internal development, not foreign adventure. A war with Korea would consume resources Japan needed for railways, factories, and the building of a modern army on the Western model. It would expose Japan to Western intervention at a moment when the unequal treaties had already demonstrated the consequences of military weakness. Okubo was right by every measure of strategic calculation. Saigō was right by every measure of what the samurai class had always been and what it needed to remain. Both men knew it. The argument was not resolvable. Their decades-long friendship ended in that disagreement, and Saigō returned to Kagoshima for the last time. In Kagoshima, Saigō established a private school, the Shigako, that grew rapidly into the dominant institution in the region. Thousands of disaffected former samurai enrolled. The school emphasized military training, the martial arts, and the Confucian ethics of the warrior tradition. It was, in effect, a parallel authority structure within Satsuma, one that the Meiji government in Tokyo watched with increasing anxiety. By the end of 1876, Satsuma had effectively ceased to be governed by the central government. Saigō's school faction controlled the prefecture. The government sent warships to remove weapons from the Kagoshima arsenal. The removal of the weapons was the trigger, but the underlying cause was the abolition of the stipends. In January 1877, the Meiji government converted samurai stipends, the rice allocations that had sustained the warrior class since the Tokugawa Settlement, into a one-time payment in government bonds, and then eliminated the annual payments entirely. For the men who had followed Saigō to Kagoshima, this was the final act. They had already lost their status as the exclusive military class. They had already lost the right to carry swords in public, removed by the Haitore Edict of 1876. Now they lost the income that had defined their economic existence since Ieyasu had separated them from the land 2.5 centuries earlier. There was nothing left of what it had meant to be a samurai, except the memory of it. Saigō was reluctant. His private correspondence from those weeks suggests a man who understood that the rebellion being pressed upon him by his followers was doomed, that the imperial army, built on conscripts, equipped with modern weapons, and backed by the administrative resources of a centralized state, would defeat any force he could field. He allowed himself to be persuaded. In January 1877, the Shigako faction attacked the government arsenals and took the weapons. Saigō placed himself at their head and marched north toward Tokyo. At the peak of the rebellion, he commanded perhaps 20,000 men. The siege of Kumamoto Castle was where the rebellion's military logic collapsed. The castle held defended by former samurai officers, commanding conscript troops who had been training for precisely this kind of fight. The imperial army arrived in force, equipped with artillery, howitzers, and observation equipment that the samurai forces had no equivalent of. Both sides had samurai officers. Both sides had men who had grown up in the warrior tradition. But one side had a modern supply chain, a telegraph network, and an unlimited capacity to replace casualties from a national conscript pool. The other did not. The rebel forces were pushed back, fighting all the way, unable to secure a decisive victory anywhere, slowly and systematically outmatched by a military system that Saigō himself had helped design. By September of 1877, Saigō and the remnant of his force, somewhere between 300 and 400 men, had retreated to the hill of Shiroyama, overlooking Kagoshima. The imperial army that surrounded them numbered in the tens of thousands. General Yamagata, Aritomo, himself a former samurai, himself a student of Yoshida Shoin, himself one of the men who had dismantled the system Saigō was defending, spent days constructing, encircling fortifications, bringing up warships to bombard the hill from the harbor, and closing every possible avenue of escape. He was not taking chances. He outnumbered his enemy by ratios that made the outcome certain. On the 24th of September, he ordered the assault. Saigō was mortally wounded in the charge down the hill that followed. His body was found at the foot of the slope. The men who had fought beside him were dead or dying. The last organized military resistance of the samurai class had ended on a hill in Kagoshima, surrounded by the modern army of a state the samurai had themselves created. The rebellion had lasted 8 months. The system, whose end it was protesting, had lasted 2.5 centuries. The popular mythology that formed around Saigō almost immediately after his death, the noble last samurai, the defender of ancient virtue against soulless modernization, obscured what his rebellion had actually been. It was not a defense of culture. It was a defense of a specific economic arrangement, hereditary military status, hereditary stipends, and the monopoly on state violence that had defined the samurai class since Hideyoshi's sword hunt. Those things were gone. The argument Saigō made at Shiroyama, that they should not have been taken, was an argument the new Japan had already answered. The defeat was not a tragedy in the aesthetic sense that Japanese popular culture would later make of it. It was the final audit of the system. The system had been unable to defend its own reason for existing, because the reason for existing Japan's security against external threat had been transferred to an institution that did not require hereditary privilege to function. The conscript army that defeated Saigō's samurai at Shiroyama had been recruited from the same villages, the same farming families, the same merchant households that the samurai class had legally outranked for 2.5 centuries. The farmers' sons had been handed rifles, given 6 weeks of training, and sent against men who had spent their lives mastering the martial arts of the warrior tradition. The farmers' sons won. The argument that samurai were warriors by nature and commoners were not the argument that had underwritten the entire Tokugawa class structure had been tested in battle and found to be incorrect. Saigō Takamori was not the last samurai in the sense the phrase has come to mean. He was the last man to make a serious military argument for a social arrangement that had already been decided against. That the argument was made with swords, in the hills above a city that had once been one of the most powerful domains in Japan, by a man who had helped build the system that defeated him, that is what makes it worth understanding, not as romance, as history. Nitobe Inazo was born in 1862, 4 years before the Sacho alliance that would bring down the Tokugawa shogunate. He had never seen a samurai in battle. By the time he was old enough to understand what the samurai class had been, it no longer existed. He was educated in Western thought, became a Quaker, studied at Johns Hopkins University in the United States, and in 1899, while recovering from exhaustion in California, he wrote a book in English explaining the Japanese warrior code to a Western audience. He called it Bushido, the Soul of Japan. It became one of the most widely read texts about Japan in the English-speaking world. Theodore Roosevelt was said to have given away copies to his friends. It was translated into Japanese in 1908, 9 years after its English publication, and was embraced in Japan with an enthusiasm that its author had not anticipated. What Nitobe described in Bushido was not history. It was aspiration dressed as history. He identified 7 core virtues of the samurai rectitude: courage, benevolence, politeness, sincerity, honor, and loyalty, and presented them as an ancient and unified code, comparable to European chivalry, that had governed the warrior class across the centuries of its existence. He drew on Confucianism, Buddhism, Shintoism, and Western Christian ethics to construct a framework that would be legible and admirable to his intended Western readers. The book was an act of cultural diplomacy, written by a man who had spent much of his life in America and who understood, better than most, how Japan was perceived abroad and what image it needed to project. The problem with the book, historically, is substantial. There was no unified code. There had never been a unified code. The term Bushido itself appeared only rarely in texts written before the Meiji era, the character combination almost entirely absent from the literature of the period it supposedly defined. What samurai ethics had existed were specific to clans, domains, and periods, contradictory across time and geography, and far more concerned with practical military obligation and hierarchical loyalty to an immediate lord than with the universal moral framework Nitobe described. The samurai class had included bureaucrats who never fought, debt-ridden administrators who pawned their stipend rice, intellectuals who critiqued the system they served, and men who killed for hire when the domain economy left them no other option. None of them had been living by a code that resembled what Nitobe put on paper in 1899. The timing of the book's Japanese reception was not incidental. It was published in English the year before Japan signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, and it found its largest Japanese audience in the years following the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, Japan's stunning military victory over a European great power that transformed the country's international standing and its own self-perception. Japan needed, in those years, a story about why it had won, a story that rooted the victory in something distinctively Japanese, something that explained military success as the expression of a cultural essence rather than the outcome of infrastructure, investment, conscript training, and industrial capacity. Bushido provided that story. The samurai warrior, disciplined and honor-bound, was retroactively made the spiritual ancestor of the conscript soldier who had defeated Russia. The fact that conscription had been specifically designed to replace the samurai monopoly on military service was not part of the narrative. The Meiji government had been building toward this mythology from the beginning. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued in 1882, had instructed Japan's new conscript forces that loyalty to the emperor was their supreme duty, redirecting the samurai's obligation to an immediate lord toward the abstract national sovereign. Yamagata Aritomo, the man who had designed the conscript army and commanded the forces that killed Saigō Takamori at Shiroyama, was also one of the most active promoters of the idea that the conscript army was spiritually continuous with the samurai tradition. The men who had dismantled the class system were simultaneously constructing the mythology that made the class system seem timeless and noble. This was not cynicism exactly. It was statecraft. Japan needed a national identity. The samurai, already the most iconic figure in Japanese history, already romanticized in popular culture before the class was abolished, were the obvious raw material. Saigō Takamori, the man who had died defending the stipend economy against the conscript army, was posthumously rehabilitated as a national hero. He was pardoned by imperial decree in 1889, the year the Meiji Constitution was promulgated. He became, in the popular imagination and in official commemoration, the noble last samurai, a figure of tragic loyalty and incorruptible warrior virtue. The inconvenient fact that what he had been loyal to was a hereditary economic arrangement, and that he had been killed by men who shared his background and his training, but had concluded the arrangement was no longer viable. None of that appeared in the statues that went up in his memory. The myth was more useful than the history. The myth was useful precisely because Japan was doing something genuinely unprecedented. It was modernizing at a speed that had no historical parallel, dismantling centuries of social structure and rebuilding a national identity from the ground up, while simultaneously competing with industrial powers that had been developing for generations. That project needed cultural continuity, a story that connected the new Japan to something older and more rooted than the Western-influenced reforms that were visibly transforming every aspect of life. The samurai provided that continuity. They were ancient. They were distinctively Japanese. They were, by 1899, safely gone, which meant they could be idealized without the inconvenience of their actual behavior complicating the image. The word Bushido does appear in earlier texts. The Hagakure, a collection of observations on the samurai, compiled in the 17 teens by Yamamoto Tsunetomo, contains some of the ideas Nitobe would later systematize. But the Hagakure was not widely read in the Edo period. It circulated within saga domain and had minimal broader influence for most of its existence. It became a canonical text of samurai ethics largely through its Meiji and later promotion, its famous opening declaration that the way of the samurai is found in death, read in the context of Meiji military ideology. became something quite different from whatever its original author had intended for a small provincial readership. The texts were real. Their elevation into a national code was a Meiji-era construction. What the Bushido mythology accomplished, over the decades that followed Nitobe's book, was the complete inversion of the actual historical relationship between the samurai class and the values ascribed to it. The Edo period samurai had spent 2.5 centuries in enforced peace, managing debt, doing paperwork, and navigating a system that had separated them from the land and made them financially dependent on the merchants they outranked. The Bushido mythology presented them as men of pure martial virtue, indifferent to material concerns, defined by a code of selfless loyalty and honorable death. One portrait was produced by living it. The other was produced 30 years after the class was abolished, by a Quaker diplomat writing in English for an American audience. The closing argument that this documentary has been building toward is not that the samurai were frauds or that their history is unimportant. It is the opposite. The samurai were one of the most significant governing classes in human history, a group that held power for 7 centuries, shaped every dimension of Japanese life, produced some of the most sophisticated administrative and intellectual traditions in East Asian history, and ultimately participated in its own dismantling with a clarity and speed that no ruling class before or since has matched. That is a more extraordinary story than the mythology. It deserves to be understood as what it was. What the samurai were, stripped of the mythology, was a legally defined hereditary class with a monopoly on state violence, sustained by land rights and then by stipends, administered through an increasingly elaborate bureaucratic system, and finally dissolved by the lower-ranking members of their own class, who understood that the system's dysfunction had become the country's greatest security vulnerability. They were not primarily warriors. They were administrators, tax collectors, record keepers, debtors, intellectuals, and critics. They carried swords they were rarely permitted to draw. They ran domains they did not own. They served lords who depended on merchants they despised. They trained in martial arts for a function that the state had made unnecessary, and in doing so they kept alive an identity that the state eventually converted into the founding mythology of a modern nation. Every ruling class builds a story about itself. The story the samurai built, or rather, the story that was built about them after they were gone, is one of history's most effective. It survived the class that supposedly embodied it, attached itself to a conscript army that had been designed to replace it, provided ideological cover for a militarist expansion that the original samurai administrators of the Edo period would barely have recognized, and persists into the present as the dominant image of pre-modern Japan in global popular culture. That persistence is itself worth understanding. A myth that durable is not an accident. It is doing something. It is filling a space that the truth, for some reason, has not been permitted to occupy. The truth is this. The samurai were a system legal, economic, political, and administrative that Japan built to manage the problem of legitimate violence, built it carefully over 7 centuries, and then found, in the 19th century, that the system had become the problem. The men who solved that problem were not revolutionaries from outside. They were products of the system, shaped by its schools and its texts and its values, who had read its contradictions clearly enough to understand that the system could not survive unchanged, and who had the courage and the competence to change it. The swords were beautiful, the paperwork was voluminous, the debt was real, and the men who abolished the class were samurai themselves, which is, in the end, the most samurai thing about the whole story.